Hello, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to another episode of the Daily Friend Show. I'm your host, Nicholas Lorimer, today joined by Mr. Chris Hattingh. In today's news, we're going to be discussing a bunch of interesting by-elections around the country. We're also going to talk a little bit more about the growth of the gambling industry. And lastly, we're going to be talking a little bit about government's new policy towards air freight in South Africa and what it hopes to do to improve the air freight situation. All right, but let's start off with the most exciting news of today, and that is the by-election results. Now, the first caveat, as always, and I think we do always say this with by-elections give you interesting data about what is going to happen in the next local government election, or even sometimes the next national election, but they are also very heavily determined by things like often the turnout is lower, often there's very strong local dynamics. Often smaller parties are able to do better because they can focus their resources on that one place. They don't have to fight an election over the whole country. And yet, they are still very important at giving us some data on what's going on in the country, particularly when you take them all together. So we talked recently, I think, about how the DA had done quite well in a township ward in Tshwane. And so let's just go into these results. The first one we're going to talk about is Ward 29, which is Diepkloof in Soweto, on the very sort of northeastern edge of Soweto, and Noordgesig, which is a formerly majority colored area. And this was an extremely heavily contested by-election. The Patriotic Alliance, the ANC, the EFF, Action SA, MK, the DA, Operation Dudula, the ACP, the AIC, the AMC, and COPE, and an independent all stood in this by-election. The PA won the ward with a pretty impressive showing, mostly driven by the support of coloured voters in that ward, winning 30% of the vote, winning the ward from the ANC. The ANC had a terrible result, getting only 23% of the vote, which is 16% down from what they got in the last election here. The EFF went up slightly to 16%. Action SA, this was formerly one of their stronger wards in the city of Joburg. They went down to 10% from 17% that they got back in 2021. MK got 4, which is not a great result. The DA had a pretty bad time, going from about 10% of the vote to about 4% of the vote. The PA performing very strongly in the voting districts that are mostly inhabited by coloured voters, winning about sort of 71% of the vote there. The DA getting about 8%, the ANC cratering from 14 to 2%. Amongst black voters, the ANC went down 17%, winning only 34%, the EFF 24, Action SA 15, MK 7, and the DA 2. So that's a pretty crazy result, very heavily contested. Disappointing, I think, for the biggest parties, the ANC and the DA. The DA, I'm sure, winning that ward was always going to be a very long shot. They'd have to fend off both the PA and also win over voters from who were leaving the ANC. And unfortunately for them, they failed to do both of those things. However, still, not the worst possible result they could have. I mean, this was not a stronghold for them. That ANC number, though, is just really terrible. It just shows how much the ANC is currently under pressure. And this isn't the only place showing that the ANC is under pressure. I mean, we've seen so many by-elections across the country where they've been under pressure, but here's another one in Northwest Province, kind of in a municipality towards the border with Botswana, Ward 7. Action SA won their first ward in the whole country. Action SA in this municipality merged with a smaller party called the Forum for Service Delivery, and that appears to have paid off. This is a ward where previously the Forum for Service Delivery got about 20% of the vote. Since they've merged with Action SA, they now in this by-election managed to grow that to 33% of the vote, winning this ward off of the ANC, who dropped 25%, losing to both Action SA and the EFF. The ANC only getting 33% of the vote. That ward was extremely tightly contested, by the way. Action SA won it by literally 2 votes, which is a crazy close election. In Swellendam, in the rural Western Cape, the ANC lost a ward that they formerly got over 50% of the vote in to the Patriotic Alliance, who got 51%. The DA going from sort of the 40s there down to about 19%, so not a great result for them either. But this perhaps is the worst result for the ANC in yesterday's by-elections. And this is in Messina, in Limpopo. So this Ward 2 in Messina, is right at the top of South Africa. It's on the border between Botswana and Zimbabwe. It actually touches both countries, I believe. It's like got the game reserve, the Makungubwe game reserve around there. And the ANC here got 63% of the vote, winning the ward easily. Now you think, okay, well, that still sounds like a pretty decent result. Like, why am I making a big deal out of it? This is really ANC heartland. And, Limpopo and the rural Eastern Cape are like the two places where the ANC has managed to hold up its vote. And here it went down by 11 points. The ANC only winning just under 63% of the vote. The DA got about 14% of the vote, which is up slightly from the 12% they got in this ward earlier. And the other parties contesting are quite interesting. One is a party called the ELF, which I believe is some sort of breakaway from the EFF, who got about 7% of the vote. The EFF, who got about 6% of the vote. A party called BABSA, which is Build a Better South Africa. I have never heard of them before, getting about 6% of the vote. And the South African Communist Party, who have been threatening to run in elections. Well, they ran in this election. It's one of the first ones I've seen them run in recent years. And they managed 3.4% of the vote, coming last. So the much vaunted entry of the SACPI into our local government elections is, I think, not going to be such a big deal. But this was all summed up quite nicely by Darby Skoltz, the election analyst. And sorry, I'm going on here, Chris. I'll give you a lot of opportunity to respond in a moment. Saying that in Joburg, the ANC went backwards by 16%. In Northwest, they went back by 25%. In Swellendam, they went back by 22%. Messina backwards by 11%. In another by-election, they went backwards by 9%. Now the ANC did advance in a election near Langeberg, in a pretty safe ward for them. But let's not. I think we don't need to talk about that one too much, because I don't think it's particularly instructive. These are results that suggest that the next local government elections, the ANC is going to see an absolute cratering of its support. Now, it's way too early to say that, but Chris, this seems to confirm other surveys that we've seen. What do you make of all this?
You stated at the beginning, Nick, once you take by-election results, perhaps sort of in isolation, we're not trying to read from it future electoral outcomes, but every by-election in the last 12 months, every poll, every statement from the ANC themselves indicates the crisis of confidence that the party faces and the crisis of just basic operational capability, as it were, from a financing point of view, paying salaries, but also just political machinery, the much vaunted ANC electoral machine. There are more and more signs that it's going to become very difficult for that machine to kick into gear close to the next local government elections and, of course, before the next national elections in 2029. So with what you said in mind about by-election results, I think there's every reason to see the continued decline of the ANC, and for the party leadership, it's yet another opportunity to either take the right lessons or continue down this sort of path. I think the probability is more on the latter. We haven't seen any kind of willingness to deal with and acknowledge the issues the party faces, where it hasn't delivered on the kinds of service delivery, bread and butter issues that most South Africans say are their priorities, that they state in polling by the Institute of Race Relations, by other organizations, time after time, year after year. Those issues remain unaddressed by the ANC, and now voters are punishing them accordingly. You've also got the crisis of confidence even amongst ANC voters, people who would have voted for the ANC, either staying away or voting for other parties as a kind of protest vote against the ANC. So it's not necessarily that they might like the policies of another party, but they're going to lean into those parties that they feel can disrupt things and really force the ANC to acknowledge its hubris and the mistakes that it's made. So very concerning signs once again for the ANC. It really is becoming the narrative around the party 30 years into our democracy, how they see themselves as this former liberation movement, the sort of hard reality of South African politics really coming home to roost for them. And I think we should also add, apart from the ANC, just how competitive and fractured our politics can become in some instances. So where perhaps the earlier this year, the feeling was it could settle into one or two parties who will take votes from the ANC. I don't think that's guaranteed. No party should feel they can take votes for granted. That would be the right kind of attitude to have, to keep working as hard as possible to get votes up until whatever date it will be, the next local government elections, because there's an element of sort of inauthenticity and taking voters for granted that some parties, in some instances, let slip, and they will be punished accordingly for that. So it's this kind of idea of not taking any votes for granted and trying to earn those votes maybe on a daily basis. I think that's vitally important in this more competitive politics that South African parties are facing.
Yeah, exactly right. And just apologies if my puppy dog barks in the background. She's spooked by something. So I like what you said about the fracturing. Particularly, there's parties that. Sorry, let me just close my door here. There's parties that get quite a lot of attention in the media. Operation Dudula is a good example, right? These are guys who have this presence. They're famous for, harassing people for their immigration status in front of hospitals and stuff. They stand in a by-election in Soweto and they get 3% of the votes. And when they stood in the provincial election in Hattingh, they also got not even a single seat in the legislature. The SACP, getting 3.8% of the vote in rural Limpopo. Now, obviously, that's probably not going to be the stronghold of the SACP, but it gives a sign that some of these parties that take up all this sort of energy in our national discourse actually have no real support, and instead, there's a lot of these other parties. I mean, does anyone know off the top of their head who the leader of the ACP is? No, but they're the same size as Operation Dudula right. in some of these by-elections.
You think, Nick, if someone like Lieutenant General Mkonazi, if he were to start a political party, I think he would do much better than a lot of these parties, and even those who supposedly have more of the oxygen on social media. I think what we've seen around an individual like him and the things he focuses on, the crime issue, there's a big gap there in South African politics.
No, I think that's exactly right, and this really is showing here is that the ANC is just kind of bleeding almost everywhere. Now, not everywhere, because there's some parts of the country, particularly the rural Eastern Cape, and until today, I would say even Limpopo, although this by-election throws that into doubt, where their supporters is holding up extremely well, but there is clearly a space now for even more people to kind of sweep in. And I think what we saw in the last local government election was all these kind of newer parties popping up and taking seats all over the place. If you go and look at the Joburg Council, you look at the Durban Council, the eThekwini Council, there's just a huge number of parties, these like tiny parties that get like one seat or something. I think there might be more of those. And these by-election results, the fierce competition shows that the PA won that ward in Joburg with 30% of the vote. If you can win a ward with 30% of the vote, and in some cases even less, the incentives for you to start your own party if you have some sort of local presence or run as an independent are actually quite high. So that might be a thing we see actually going into our next local government elections, even more fracturing. It's too early to say, but I wouldn't rule it out by any means. Okay. Next thing to go on to, the National Gambling Board, who are the regulators of gambling in South Africa, have said that they are worried about illegal online gambling and also of grant recipients turning to gambling for relief. South African gambling operators, according to the National Gambling Board, had a gross revenue of about 75 billion rand in the last financial year. However, they believe that there's an enormous amount of gambling going on illegal online gambling platforms. Many of them run out of the reporting here from Business Day suggests from Curacao in the Caribbean, which doesn't regulate casinos that operate online in South Africa. The National Gambling Board has called for more regulation. About 60% of all of the gambling industry's gross gambling revenue was generated from legal online betting. And mostly this has been driven by technological change, with online betting becoming much easier through basically smartphones and apps and gambling apps and that kind of thing. They also said that the National Gambling Act of 2004 is no longer adequate to the changes in the gambling environment. The DA spokesperson on Trade, Industry and Competition, Toby Chance, said has put forward a private members bill, the Remote Gambling Bill, which aims to regulate and require the licensing of online and remote gambling. Chris, what do you make of all this? I must say that while I'm generally not a fan of regulating things and imposing restrictions, I do get a bit depressed and nervous about gambling, particularly when people don't have a lot of economic hope in their lives, that they can, in desperation, turn to something like gambling in the hope of making their life better or at least make it more exciting. And I don't know. I'm sympathetic to this stuff, but I'm not fully sold on it. What do you make of regulating the gambling industry?
I definitely share your sentiments in that regard. One, ideally sort of gut feeling, one would want as little regulation as possible, and how it would be done is, I guess, the most important. So not just the intentions of it, but exactly how technically it's done. And if there is then movement around the regulations, what are the incentives? So how does that still pursued? I mean, we saw during COVID, you saw very irrational and immoral regulations, and how citizens, the economy, tried to move around them, and then the consequences over time for the fiscus, for the government, for all that kind of thing.
Yeah, I mean, the illegal cigarette market just absolutely exploded and has never retreated back after the ban on smoking during COVID, which is just such an insane time. I actually can't believe it happened.
So here, I mean, you do see a little bit of the issue, actually not just a little bit, a lot of the issue around our low growth, high unemployment reality. Between 2012 2023, we averaged 0.8% growth. Our unemployment rate remains consistently above 43-44% on the expanded definition, probably even higher. That kind of that drives a kind of desperation where if you think you've got some kind of chance to earn not an income, but just some kind of additional resources that you can use to buy food, to pay for the next month of your child's schooling, it forces you into those very desperate situations where even if something looks remote, sort of from a probability point of view, you're still willing to take the chance. You also couple the low growth situation and environment with very anti-business, high regulation, anti-growth policy and legislation situations. So even if you have an idea around starting a small business or or if you've started one and you want to grow it, expand it and employ people, the amount of red tape, bureaucracy, regulations you have to deal with, how it discourages businesses from employing more people. It also then forces you into that situation from an entry point of view. If you can't even get into work, why not just try what's sort of available to you, whether it's legal or illegal? And nowadays, with the growth of online sports betting, especially with the penetration of mobile data and access to the internet across South Africa and sub-Saharan Africa, I think more and more people in their desperation could try and turn to this sort of thing. So it's one thing to say that you would want to regulate it. I don't want to sort of knee-jerk to say, well, just leave it alone. It's people making their own supposedly rational, free decisions. But if there is regulation, I think it has to be coupled with other kinds of initiatives. There needs to be a different approach to this sort of issue, because I think in the desperation, it's just going to continue. If you have regulation, it'll force people to just continue to pursue online betting, however they might be able to do so. And probably that could then result in more exploitation. You will have higher and more stringent terms and conditions. Should you lose a bet, should you not repay what you owe to a particular lender or a particular platform? Those kinds of things then get encouraged. It becomes much more, it becomes the sort of underground, I guess, in sector, as it were.
And I think like so many of our problems, like our drug problems, for example, they're driven by a sort of major social collapse. The fact that many families are broken, the fact that many kids grow up, without parents, the fact that there's no jobs, all these sort of the kind of dangerous environment, the high levels of crime, all these things, sort of have degraded our society in a lot of ways. And that you can put in whatever laws, and even if you had, a strong regulator and a strong police force to enforce all of those, until you fix those much deeper social problems that are driven by, partly by poverty and partly by history and partly by bad policy choices, you're really not going to be able to make much headway on stuff like gambling, because people are desperate for some kind of escape from the situation that we're in. So yeah, I think that is the much more difficult conversation that probably needs to be had about all of this stuff. And it's also a much harder problem to solve, particularly from a sort of policy angle, because it's a lot of people making better choices in their own lives, and that's a very difficult thing to enforce to happen with government, as history has shown us.
Okay. Just on that note, so just today in Business Day, the CEO of the Institute, Dr. John Endres, he talked about two recent, data points that portray the economic and sort of moral decay situation in which South Africa finds itself. So just to link it to the economic situation. So, and I quote from his piece, John writes, "Two figures published this week should stop South Africans in their tracks. The first, from the Reserve Bank, shows that non-financial companies are holding a record 1.8 trillion rand in cash, the largest hoard in the country's history. The second, reported in these pages, namely Business Day, is that 21% of South Africa's children under the age of 5 are stunted because of malnutrition," end quote. That second point, that doesn't happen in a vacuum. It doesn't happen just, sort of on its own. It's the consequence of the wrong policy choices. It's a consequence of the ideology that the ANC has pursued. And it's unfortunately a necessary consequence. It's a bug, it's a feature of the policies that have been implemented in the last 30 years. And we see that, unfortunately, really coming home to bear now. So linking this to the desperation that we see in the growth of online gambling.
Last story for today, Chris. Department of Transport has put forward a new policy hoping to upgrade South Africa's air freight infrastructure, about 90% of which goes through OR Tambo International Airport in Johannesburg. The Department of Transport says that these our facilities for air freight are really bad, and that with lots of people ordering stuff from overseas through, like Temu and Amazon and things like that, it's in desperate need of private investment to see upgrades. What do you make of this story?
Well, I do agree with that point. And if people, listeners, viewers, will be intimately familiar with the declining state of many South Africa's airports, maybe the one that comes to mind most often, and all the examples, you have regular electricity outages, regular water outages at OR Tambo. South Africa's largest airport really should be functioning optimally from a tourism point of view, from a business point of view, an international airport of that size. So I agree on the necessity for capital investments across the board for AXA, when you look at capacitating basic services in the airport terminal, but also when you look on the air freight side. So making sure you've got enough spots for unloading, you've got enough equipment, all the different kinds of trucks that you might need, pallets, any sort of equipment that you will need. You need capital investment for that. So I share that point. However, it depends now how the private sector engages with this. Do they go along to get along, or when they see the wrong kinds of policies in place that have precipitated this situation, do they push back? Do they then require changes from government side, be that national government, provincial government, be it AXA, other airport-related entities, or not? Or do they just sort of say, yes, we'll deploy our capital, let's sort of put a plaster on this wound and then deal with the consequences again in 20 years or 50 years or whatever it might be? So in a way, it's good to see these different kinds of admissions by government. We're seeing it in some examples lately. We have the current Minister of Police, who earlier this week warned of the broader security situation in South Africa, and to me, a bit of a veiled call for help to the private sector. But again, it depends on how far the government goes in terms of saying, yes, we realize this is a problem, and what policies can we reform or change or remove that are inhibiting real investment and skill sharing and bringing to the table the capacity of the private sector.
Excuse me. And with that, let us call it to a close there. I hope that you all had an interesting had an interesting time listening to the show today, and we will be back tomorrow with the Daily Friend Show, the live version at 1:30. See you all then. Have a good time. Bye-bye. The Daily Friend Show and the Daily Friend are a project of the Institute of Race Relations, the IRR. The IRR is a think tank which was founded in 1929 to study race relations in South Africa and works to change government policy to improve race relations through non-racialism and to ensure the prosperity of all South Africans. If you like our work and would like to support us, please go to irr.org.za and click Support the IRR. Or you can go to thedailyfriend.co.za and click the Fund Us button.